Hello and welcome to our podcast. We're Sky2shore, a climate campaign. I'm Nina.
I'm Olivia.
And I'm Oscar.
And today we're joined by Grace Blakeley, writer, economist, and a leading voice on how capitalism, politics, and the climate crisis fit together. We're here to talk about her work, climate activism, and what we need to confront in order for a fairer, greener world. So tell us a bit about yourself, Grace.
Hi guys, thank you so much for having me. As you said, I am an author. I write about kind of politics and economics and anti-capitalism, basically. So my latest book, Vulture Capitalism, was really looking at like how actually existing capitalist societies work and showing that they're not the kind of nice free market democratic utopias that we're often presented with, and instead rely on monopoly and political corruption and lots of issues that we're kind of, used to seeing in the news now on a daily basis. I looked at how we can kind of think about building movements and networks that can start to resist and create something new.
So you recently joined the Green Party. Could you tell us a little bit about how they're working to combat climate change?
Yeah, so I joined the Green Party a while back now to vote for Zach Polanski, who I knew before he started running to be leader of the Green Party. I'd left Labour. I'd been quite involved in the Labour Party in previous years. And then I left under Keir Starmer. And the main reason for me leaving was when Keir Starmer said that Israel had the right to cut off water and power to Gaza, which at the time, as everyone pointed out, constituted a war crime. And things kind of didn't really get better for Labour after that in terms of their stance on Gaza. So that was a really big push for me. But I think, even if I hadn't already left Labour, I would have joined the Greens when Zach started running because his platform is so exciting. He's running on things that the left has been campaigning for a very long time. So things like a wealth tax, for example, on like expanding public ownership and reversing privatization, on dealing with the housing crisis. And obviously underpinning all of that is a deep commitment to environmentalism and the climate. But I think what's really exciting about Zach's agenda is it's kind of like this like eco-socialist agenda. So a lot of the time Green parties have kind of fallen into the trap of basically kind of telling everyone off and saying like, you shouldn't drive a car and you shouldn't eat meat, and like making climate action this like individualized responsibility, when we know that it's like massive corporations that are responsible for most of the emissions that we see, and also that like the decisions that we make as individuals are part of a broader context. So if you're driving to work, it's often because you don't have access to public transport or because it's too expensive. So like realizing that we need to change the kind of systems that underpin the way we produce energy, the way we transport things, rather than just trying to change individual behavior, is I think what's really exciting about the Greens agenda right now. And it's really central to my own climate action as well, and how I think we need to kind of, we need to understand environmentalism.
Yeah, so definitely going off of that, you're quite a strong critique of how capitalism handles the climate crisis. Can you explain why this is a problem and what is your solution to this? How can democracy help climate action?
That's a big question. So yeah, I mean, there are some authors who've written about how fossil fuels are really kind of like part of the way that capitalism works. If you think about the development of industrial capitalism, it was incredibly intertwined with the kind of the use of fossil fuels in industrialization. And that isn't a coincidence. It shaped the kind of societies that we've ended up, living in, basically. When we discovered that we could use this seemingly endless source of energy that was available, in the ground for us to just tap into. We chanced upon this kind of like what Marx called like a free gift of nature, and thought, okay, well, we're going to use this free gift to kind of power constant accumulation, to generate profits for a very small number of people. And, the way that was done was in a kind of peculiarly capitalist way. If there's lots of resources under the ground that we all live on, you would think logically, right, okay, well, those resources belong to all of us. But instead, because we have this logic of kind of private ownership, you had a small number of people becoming extremely rich after, fossil fuels are found on their land somewhere. And then this kind of logic of predation and imperialism that encourages fossil fuel companies to kind of go all over the world, toppling governments to get access to oil and grabbing land everywhere they can. So fossil fuels and capitalism just become really, really intimately connected. But they also become connected to the resistance to capitalism. So what's interesting about the fossil fuel economy, especially coal, is that for a while it provided workers who were organized with really clear ways that they could kind of push back against those at the top, because someone needs to take the coal out of the ground and put it and load it up into trains where it can be transported. And we saw periodically workers who were very well organized saying, no, we're not going to do that until you pay us proper wages. And this was, of course, at the core of the transition to neoliberalism, with Margaret Thatcher going to war against the miners in this country and eventually kind of shutting down those mines as we moved to the extraction of North Sea oil, which was once again basically wasted and served to enrich shareholders rather than the British people as a whole. So, fossil fuels are just like deeply, deeply connected to capitalism, to all of the kind of changes that we've seen in the nature of capitalism. And today, as we transition to renewables, we're seeing a push for this kind of like green capitalism, right? Which relies much more on renewables rather than fossil fuels. But we're already seeing loads of problems with this because capital and fossil fuels are so deeply interconnected. It's become a challenge to imagine even moving away from those things. And it's particularly because basically it's hard to make renewable energy scarce. And scarcity is what generates profits. Because once you've built a solar array or a wind turbine, you cannot stop the wind from blowing or the sun from shining. And if you can't enclose and limit the production of something, then it becomes hard to regulate the price, which means it becomes hard to make sure that you're kind of constantly generating profits. And that is what stood in the way of the rollout of renewables. It's not that they're too expensive. They're actually very, very cheap now, cheaper than lots of other forms of non-renewable energy. It's that they don't reliably provide profits for those who own those resources, which is why we've seen countries like China, for example, which have much more state ownership, basically, lead the way when it comes to the rollout of renewables. Of course, with lots of other challenges involved in that. So it's kind of really leading to I wouldn't say a crisis of capitalism quite yet, but certainly some problems and challenges in terms of how we produce energy in a capitalist society. And that's partly why in the US, for example, we've seen this backlash against climate goals, because there are lots of very powerful vested interests who make tons of money from continuing to extract fossil fuels out of the ground. And Trump is very much on their side.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Exactly. So you really went into detail there about how fossil fuels are being used by these companies to create profit. What kind of action do you think is needed to challenge their power effectively?
Great question. So the big problem with fossil fuels today is not just that the companies themselves are doing so much damage. It's that they are using their power to really influence our democracies and our politicians. And you see very, very close links between big fossil fuel companies, political parties, and the state all over the world, but particularly in the rich world. So even in the UK, for example, we spend about 17 billion each year giving subsidies to fossil fuel companies, right? Not even not taxing them properly, actually giving them taxpayers' money. And it's the same in lots of other parts of the world as well. In the US, I write about in my book, Vulture Capitalism, the very close links between ExxonMobil and the US government. Now, ExxonMobil knew about climate breakdown back in the 1970s. It had its climate research team and its scientists look into the greenhouse effect and they showed that burning fossil fuels would cause climate breakdown. And so in response, Exxon cut funding for that research team and instead spent all of that money on basically spreading climate denialism. And they've been very successful in doing so by basically casting doubt on the science, sponsoring politicians who are kind of anti-action on climate breakdown. And also, one of the interesting things is that we recently saw a ExxonMobil lobbyist undercover talking to an undercover Greenpeace reporter. And the Greenpeace reporter basically got them to admit that they'd been pushing for a carbon tax, which is a tax that would basically be levied on individuals for using carbon, because they knew it would be unpopular and would block more systematic action on climate breakdown. So they've used lots of different strategies to kind of delay the transition. And, the way that they've been able to do that is because they've had such close relationships with politicians. So ExxonMobil's former CEO, for example, became Secretary of State under Donald Trump. Like, there's this revolving door between the fossil fuel sector and parts of the state. And more generally, they spend tons and tons of money on lobbying, on comms, on think tanks, spreading doubt, and also encouraging us to think about these individualistic solutions to climate breakdown. The whole idea of the carbon footprint was actually a BP marketing campaign, rather than, something that was come up with by the climate movement itself. So it's really that challenge that we face when thinking about how we resist it, because we need to find ways of balancing out the power of the fossil fuel companies and their influence over politicians, which really requires us to all get much more involved in politics in one way or another, whether that's joining a climate movement that's going and sitting outside the offices of the big fossil fuel companies and trying to make it harder for them to operate, or whether it's joining a political party and pushing those politicians to stop accepting meetings with fossil fuel companies and instead listen to what the vast majority of people want, which is action on climate breakdown.
Yeah, so kind of going off on that, what can ordinary people do to help climate solutions and climate action?
Get involved in politics,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not just enough to change your own individual behavior. We have to think about how we change society. Like I said, it's easy to think about, I'm going to stop eating, meat, or I'm going to stop using a car or whatever. Not easy, but that's something you at least feel like you can do right now. But the issue is that unless those individual actions become part of a broader movement, they're inherently going to be very limited to people who have the time, the money, and the inclination to want to do those things. So instead, we need to change the choice structure of our society so that the easiest option for everyone is also the greenest option. That means investing in public transport. It means making sure that our energy is produced using renewable sources, so that when you do use energy, you know that it is coming from a renewable source. It means, investing in things like retrofitting our housing stock so that it's much more environmentally friendly. All of these things are kind of big systemic actions that would allow us to create much bigger shifts. And they come not from individuals deciding to change their consumption decisions, but from people getting involved in politics and pushing politicians to act differently. So that could be, as I said, joining a movement, there's lots of the Green New Deal Rising and the Stop Rosebank campaign, for example, are two campaigns that I think are really, really brilliant. But also, get involved in your local Green Party, get involved in your local Labour Party, and start demanding, writing to your MP, demanding that they act on climate breakdown. Because at the moment, they think that people don't care because there's been a shift towards cost of living issues. But if you ask people, they do care. And also, the climate is linked to the cost of living. Because why did we see such a significant increase in prices a couple of years ago? It was largely because the price of fossil fuels increased. And if we had proper access to reliable renewable energy, those sorts of shocks wouldn't happen again. So yeah, we just need to be really pushing our politicians to care about this stuff, so that we can make real systematic change.
Yeah, it's crazy how everything's interlinked.
Yeah.
Housing crisis, climate
Domino
change.
effect.
How does that blows your mind?
Exactly.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what is missing from mainstream conversations about climate policy?
I think it really is that link, as you were saying,
Yeah.
to how we live our lives every day. It's easy to think of climate as this kind of hippy dippy issue that only eco people care about. But it is so linked to how we produce things, prices in our economy, whether or not we're able to heat our homes, all of these things. If we were to retrofit our housing stock and provide better insulation, it would bring down heating bills. If we were to invest much more in renewables, it would bring down bills and de-link those from fossil fuels. So yeah, we really need a conversation about how investing in decarbonisation isn't just like good for the planet, it's also good for all of us. Oh, and by the way, if we fail to do so, we're going to be, have large parts of the country that are prone to periodic flooding, where houses become uninsurable, where you can't get a mortgage. We're looking at things like the Atlantic meridional oceanic circulation shutting down, which is the currents that circulate warm air around the Atlantic and are what make Northern Europe much more mild than somewhere like Canada, which is on the same latitude. If that breaks down, as it is already showing signs of doing, we'll have Canadian weather, basically. And our infrastructure isn't built to cope with that. So there are huge costs to not acting, and there are huge benefits to acting now and quickly. And I think we really need to shift the conversation away from like telling people off towards like framing this as something that just makes sense.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. When you think about your own climate activism, what forms of action do you believe make the biggest impact right now? So you talk a lot about protests and joining parties, but what personally do you think is the best?
I mean, right now, I think it changes from time to time, right? You have to like look at the political context and see where the best opportunities for action are at any one time. And right now, I'm just super excited about the Green Party. Like, they're overtaking Labour in the polls. That's crazy. And not only do I think they're going to get a lot of MPs at the next election, I also think it's going to terrify Labour into doing something to win back those votes. And we've already seen that. With the budget that we just saw, Rachel Reeves introduced a number of measures that weren't a wealth tax, but were clearly influenced by the push that we've had from so many campaigners for Labour to introduce a wealth tax. So when you have these powerful political movements that make politicians scared of losing their seats, that's when you actually start seeing real change. So that's, what I'm doing right now with a lot of my spare time. And I guess, that's what I would encourage people who really care about the climate to do as well.
Yeah.
How would you say the climate, like, how's climate justice and economic justice so like connected? Because I would say they are, but in your opinion, how would you kind of explain that?
They really, really very much are. Firstly, because as I've said, like failing to act on climate breakdown is going to not just like harm our own economies in the rich world, but also plunge like millions of people into poverty. There are so many people who are living in places that are already becoming uninhabitable, whether because of desertification, because of flooding, because, the crops that they once grew are now much harder to grow because of changing climate. But also because like moving towards a greener economy will create opportunities for new jobs, for innovation, and it will also make our lives better and more livable because it can bring down energy bills, but also it can deal with things like air pollution, which kills so many people like each year.
Yeah.
And still, even in the UK, kills so many people. Like clean air is such an important thing that we take for granted. But, in so many parts of the world, in India, for example, it's killing tons and tons of people each year. Yeah. So like clean air being a really significant part of that struggle for economic justice, and one which disproportionately, again, affects poorer people. But I also think, we're moving into a world where it's becoming easy to think of like the economy as something completely unmoored from reality, something that just happens in data centers and kind of on computers and whatever, because AI is becoming such a big part of our economy and people are going to lose jobs and it's going to, exacerbate inequality. And investing in decarbonisation is one of those things that we can do to the material world that creates jobs, that, allows us to build infrastructure that balances out our economy, because everywhere in the country needs this kind of investment, and which does so sustainably for a long period of time. So, yeah, I think like decarbonisation creates so many opportunities to rebalance our economy and make it less unfair.
So I know you touched on this a couple of questions ago, but what gives you hope when you look at the climate movement today? Like, do you think people will join movements and things like that?
I honestly feel so hopeful looking at the climate movement today. It's been a couple of really tough years with people like Trump basically saying, decarbonisation is over and the woke climate agenda is getting shut down and all that kind of, stupid stuff. But now I see not just like green parties and politicians doing really well all over the world, but also amazing new campaigns that are achieving wins. So like one that I'm really excited about at the moment is the Stop Rosebank campaign. Labour has been saying that it now wants to allow the Rosebank oil field to be developed, which would mean, more fossil fuels being extracted out of the ground, more carbon emissions, and the benefits would not accrue to ordinary people. They would largely go to shareholders. So fighting back against that and saying like this is not the kind of like economic development that our communities need, that it's not going to really like support the interests of ordinary people, and it's going to exacerbate climate breakdown. I'm really excited about that campaign, and they're doing really, really, really well. I'd encourage everyone to follow Stop Rosebank, and get involved if you can.
That is really interesting, and this has been a really, really interesting interview. As a last question, if you had the power to implement one climate policy overnight with no political resistance, what would you choose and why?
I think keep it in the ground. Stop all new fossil fuel exploration. Just like stop the development of new oil fields. And that would really create some impetus to encourage governments to invest much more in renewables. This is something that a number of countries have already committed to. Countries like Ecuador, for example, just saying we do not want our oil fields to be further developed. And if we could push for that, it would accelerate the transition to renewable energy much, much quicker, and would really show the fossil fuel industry that it's, on its last legs. And I think doing it would actually probably require, as another step, ending fossil fuel lobbying, completely making it illegal.
Thank you so much, Grace. This has been really, really interesting.
It's been lovely to have you.
Yeah,
thank you so much, guys. It's been great chatting to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See ya.